All right, we all set? Okay. Good morning, or at least for the next couple of minutes. Environmental surveys. Most of you will not have the opportunity to issue international certificates for environmental compliance. I've had that responsibility in the past. We'll talk about that in a minute. But when you're on deep draft ships, environmental compliance, environmental awareness is at an all-time high now. Did some research recently, and since 2008 through about 2018, there have been, on an average in the United States, between 6 and 8 plea agreements with commercial shipping operators for environmental crimes. On average, the ship owner, ship operator is being fined approximately $1 million. They are put on 3 years of probation, during which they have to enact an environmental compliance plan that is court approved, which requires them to hire a court-appointed monitor who conducts annual audits of the company and all of their ships. So you can easily estimate that over that time they will spend another $1 million plus in that process alone. Part of what I'm gonna cover this morning or this afternoon is based upon some recent experiences I've had. Many of you heard a few years ago that Carnival Cruise Line and Princess Cruise Line pled guilty to environmental crimes. They were assessed a record fine of $40 million. That has since had an additional $20 million added to it. They were required to do a 5-year environmental compliance program that included sampling of tanks on board the ships, overboard discharges annually, not only a court-appointed monitor, but a third-party auditing system, which is where I came in. That has cost them in the first year to 2 years, plus additional training, outfitting new equipment and everything else, cost them an additional $200 million in the first year to 2 years. A lot of that is, and in that particular case, all of the evidence came from a whistleblower.
You forgot to say the whistleblower actually got a portion of that settlement.
Yes, they do, and they do. I've been involved in peripherally in a lot of these, going back to the very first one in 1993 when a passenger videotaped a Princess cruise ship crew throwing plastic bags of trash over the side at night, and the initial fine at that point was $500,000, and the whistleblower got $250,000 out of that. So the whistleblowers can get up to half of it. My background: I'm a US Coastguard Academy grad. Studied marine engineering, naval arc. Spent 20 years in the Coast Guard, a couple years as an engineer, and then 17 years conducting US flag port state control inspections and surveys, a year as a casualty investigator. Retired, went to work for DNV as a principal surveyor, spent 7 years with them as a principal surveyor, conducting annual class surveys, as well as recognized organization flag state surveys and issuing SOLAS and MARPOL certificates. Left them, got the opportunity to go put a new cruise company into service, spent a year as in charge of operations and marine operations for the company. And then I left that, and with a colleague, we started our own company, and we've been doing surveying and technical consulting for about 4 years now. Vast majority at the moment of our business is cruise or passenger ship related, although we have done some work with some cargo companies, military sea lift, and some of those folks. I want to pick up on something that Todd said yesterday, because you'll hear me go into some of this. Loved your definition on a what was it, for a moral, a story. Well, I've got a question. Does anybody know the difference between a fairy tale and a sea story? One starts once upon a time, the other says, this is no shit. Yep, exactly. So, all right. So I will try to avoid using the catchphrase, but it may creep in once in a while. Basically, I'm not going to cover MARPOL Annex 2 or Annex 3. Those are somewhat specialized and not normally run into when you start talking about noxious liquid substances, which is a lot of chemicals, and packaged harmful substances are Annex 3. So we'll talk some oil pollution, sewage, garbage, air pollution, which is huge right now, and I'll touch a little bit on ballast because that's kind of an amoeba at the moment, and where things are and where they're going. How many of you, prior to your survey, actually sit down and put together a plan or some sort of, or actually just even, doesn't have to be something in writing, but actually think about how you are going to do your survey? Come up with a process. Okay? Most of us do. Otherwise, Mike gets our reports because we missed something. It doesn't have to be extensive. When I do some of our condition surveys, we will actually go to the extent of putting together a schedule listing all of the areas that we want to inspect. We'll, which day of the survey we want to do it, and either in the morning, the afternoon, trying to give the ship some ability to plan around their operations, or so that we can avoid impacting their operations. So this is typically the process that I would recommend when you're doing an environmental survey. Start with your documentation, the certificates, because those SOLAS and those MARPOL certificates are correct, right? 2 years of audits. I had half a dozen certificates that had errors on them. I just finished a pre-purchase survey on a cruise ship. Certificates had problems on them, or at least areas of question. But more importantly, there is critical information that you need to know when you start going down into the spaces and walk in the spaces so you can check it. So I always recommend start with the certificates, start with what the ship's procedures are. Unfortunately, we're calling this environmental surveys, but they're almost as much the A word that we all as surveyors hate. They're almost audits if you're going to do a comprehensive job on it. Then I can get into either visual inspections or testing, vice versa. Depends again on the ship's operation, depending on what we're doing. So we'll start with Annex 1 with documentation on the oil. So first off here, and these are excerpts from some of the IOPP certificates. Most of these are Form A's that I've pulled off of passenger ships or general cargo ships. I didn't have any tankers that were readily available. First section that's somewhat critical is what kind of equipment's installed for oily water separating. Make, model, manufacturer, all that information, because later on we're going to want to check that. It's not uncommon, especially on some of the other systems, the other environmental systems, where equipment has been updated, upgraded, old models discarded, and new stuff put on in the certificates, because class, when they issue these certificates, it's coming out of their database. So if the surveyor didn't update their database when they did the commissioning of the new piece of equipment, it'll continue right through forever. Next piece is the is section 2.3, 2.33. what resolutions is your filtering and monitoring equipment approved under? At this point, any new installations are basically required under MARPOL, under resolution MEPC 10749. Older equipment still serviceable and still in use can be retained on board. But again, if you start having problem with the equipment, you need to be able to know, to be able to go back to where you, which set of regulations are applicable to it. And that's a point I didn't make initially, but again, that goes back to our planning. What set of regulations are applicable? Over 400 gross tons, MARPOL Annex 1 is applicable. Annex 5 is applicable to a larger population. So where and what's applicable? Tanks, sludge tanks, capacities, and location. Now, we're not obviously going to be climbing tanks and inspecting them, but again, as we start doing our survey and doing our walkthrough, and we'll talk a little bit more when we get into what's going on with the scrubbers and everything else, you start looking at modifications to the ship. Tanks are being corrupted or being absorbed for uses, for other uses on board. And so they change it. The last thing that ever gets changed is the tank capacity drawing. That was developed at the and printed and stamped when the ship was delivered. And I can quite confidently say that probably 90% of them or more have never been updated since, and the ship's 30, 40, 50 years old. And they've changed. Some they're using ballast tanks now to hold gray water. They're using they needed additional oily bilge capacity, so they've brought another tank and they've subdivided it, whatever. So drawings. Again, here's our oily bilge system, our oily bilge tanks, and again, capacities, locations, good information to have when you're doing your survey. And then the last part is right next to the signature block is where the issuing authorities will put exemptions, notes, odd arrangements. This particular one here talks about a white box on the bilge discharge line. As part of, this goes back to a practice that the cruise line started during their first round of environmental crime cases in 98 through 2001, 2002. And as part of their plea agreements at that point, in addition to the oil content meters that are mounted on the oily water separators, the overboard discharge line had a second sensor and a second oil content monitor put in at the discharge, right at the side shell. And so they create, or just before. So they added a second container that was put in a caged enclosure with under lock and key that the chief engineer had, or the environmental officer in the case of cruise ships. And so that's the white box, because it's not the black box that the aviation experts want to recover after an accident. So that's how that term came. But that's the what you see there. So again, critical information. So on this ship, on a cruise ship, I may have at minimum of 3, in some cases 4 oil content meters that I need to witness operation of and see. Oil record books. How many people have looked at these? And how many captains hate them? Okay. Signatures. These, if you go back and look at the environmental crimes case in the US for oil pollution, every one of them, this is the culprit. This is what they cite, and what they cite is either obstruction of justice, false official statements. If it's, because in all those cases, There was an illegal discharge. It was not recorded in the oil record book. The oil record book was presented to a government official, i.e. the Coast Guard inspector. Therefore, you've made a false official statement and you've obstructed justice because the Coast Guard could not observe or was not made aware of the illegal discharge.
So I don't go to jail. I know how to fill one of these things out. And I make sure the engineer, the chief engineer that I work with, understands how to fill it out before he starts to ditch.
Exactly.
And he hates me for it until he understands the importance.
Right. Great. Yeah, there's a lot in the policies, and that's why I say you've got to be careful, and you've got to it's an audit, because, for instance, on this particular ship, the ship was Italian registered. In Italy, the Italian government requires that all oil record book entries have one in English and one in Italian. The same entry has to be done twice. And on top of that, they have a requirement that for, and I think I've got a picture of it. Look, I hit the wrong button. Yeah, here. So this Part H, when they do bunkering, the Italian government requires that not only do they do a bunkering, which is the operations 26 in the machinery section of it, but they also have to do an immediate entry under Part 3 in their oil record books, which is air pollution. So again, it's an audit. You've got to check all these things. One of the things that I learned during this doing these audits is the importance of checking and doing a count, and I'll call it an audit, of things like the sludge. And pick a 30-day window, a 60-day window. Sludge works great because there's a requirement in MARPOL that once a week you have to sound every sludge tank and record the soundings. So you have a weekly sounding, and then every time they either burn it or every time they discharge it ashore, you have an entry. So now you can go ahead and you can audit that by picking a 30-day window, and you either start the day you're on and you work your way backwards, or you pick a day in the past and start looking at your receipts and everything else and your discharges and do the addition. Why is that important? I had a case on one of the audits where we found, over the course of a 30-day audit, I had an 11 cubic meter difference in the sludges. And we couldn't figure out why, until we started to go back and look, and we found out that the fuel oil separators automatically discharged when they did their hourly, when they were running, when they did their hourly cycle, they were automatically discharging into the sludge tank. That doesn't get recorded anywhere because it's an automatic operation. It doesn't get accounted for. So as a third party, I'm doing my audit. If I find that discrepancy, and if I didn't take the time to go through it, I just tell the court, hey, they had 11 cubic meter difference. Well, now there's all sorts of alarms and whistles and red flags and lawyers running around and everything else. So good way to do it. And in that particular case, the ship had 2 sludge tanks. We were able to divert all of the fuel oil purifiers into 1 sludge tank, and all of the normal transfers that they were doing in-house into the other tank. And now they could do their weekly soundings, and they could tell exactly how much was coming in from the sludge, from the separators. Again, part of your survey or / audit, bunker receipts, comparing those against the oil record book entries. It's another area that gets confusing. Here in the U.S., a lot of the suppliers like to tell you how many thousands of gallons, especially on the smaller coastal ships. They'll tell you, I brought 10,000, 3 trucks at 8,000 gallons a truck, and that's what gets entered in. But yet the oil record book calls for cubic meters, or, you know, so all of a sudden the conversion factors and everything else get screwy. There's also a requirement under MARPOL to retain a MARPOL fuel sample for a year. Again, this is, you know, typically what I do here is, as I'm going through the bunker receipts, I'll pick over the last year, I'll just reach in, grab 2 or 3 or 4, pull them out, write down the seal numbers from those bunker receipts, because they're required to be recorded. And then I go over and ask the engineer to take me down to their samples and show me those samples. Are they being retained on board? And that's all for the purpose of being if you have problems with down the road, the company wants it because at the end, down the road, they want to, if they have any problems and they want to be able to go back to the bunker supplier and contest that. But also for now with the Annex 6 air pollution requirements, being able to confirm what sulfur percentages were delivered on board. And finally, drawings, and we talked about those. Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to jump into bunker stations. This is, I've probably come across half a dozen ships in the last 2 years where this has become an issue. All of our connections are supposed to be inside a containment area in our bunker stations. Unfortunately, when they built the ship, as you can see here, we've got our so we've got our side shell door here. That's a pretty tough radius for a bunker hose. So typically what they do is they'll start adding elbows and 45s and things like that on. They'll just bolt them onto the end of the connection. Well, you can see here, this one is no longer under the containment. Here they've actually added the 45 and they added the containment around it. They extended it. Like I said, probably 1 out of 3 ships I go on now, I find that the bunker connections are no longer inside the containment. And again, we talked about the drawings. So Annex 4, sewage. A couple things off of the certificates to look at. Your equipment on board. And like I said, this can easily change on a ship that's 30 or 40 years old, where the old Hamworthy Tridents that they marine sanitation devices that they put in 30 or 40 years ago, the tanks rotted out, the piping is all plugged up or whatever, and so they can't get parts for the components. So they're struggling to get chemicals or whatever, so they choose to upgrade it so they can reduce the footprint or whatever else, and they forget to add or change the certificate. Another document that they're required to have is there are times where, especially on a ship that only has a single sewage plant, there are times where you need to discharge black water directly overboard. And there's a minimum rate so that it will be diluted. And they're not supposed to discharge raw sewage at less than 6 knots while in transit, yada, yada, yada. So they're supposed to have an approved maximum rate of discharge. At what volume can the pumps be turned on to discharge, or do they need to speed the ship up or slow it down? You're going to want to check that. If there's documentation that they're doing that, then we need to check the logs, see what kind of speeds and stuff what they're doing. Annex 5, garbage management. There's some very basic requirements, and those changed about 4 or 5 years ago when they eliminated things like dunnage and a lot of that. So it's basically down to comminuted foodstuffs and It's about it that can be legally discharged nowadays. They have to have ships over a certain size, have to have an approved garbage management plan. So do they have one? Garbage logs, again, spot check. Are they, when they enter that they're turning on the incinerator, are they in an area where they, they're supposed to log the Latin longitude and time, take the chart out, were they in that area? Are they in the proper area? Are they outside the ECA or the whatever else? Are they doing it down in the Caribbean where we've got a wider special area that they can't do it? Whatever. Garbage receipts is another problem area. Yeah. They talk about some. It comes and goes. Right now, as far as for garbage, I'm not hearing and seeing a lot. The big ones, the Baltic Sea, they just went in. The Baltic went into full effect because they finally determined that there was enough shoreside facilities that could receive garbage in the Baltic to enable them to start enforcing that.
When you get the ships that incinerate plastic, do they have multiple incinerators? Because once you infect an incinerator, the plastic product's always in there, or the ashes.
Correct.
So are they allowed to dump this into the oceans?
That's the question. And I was going to get to that, but that is one of the that's fine, because I have it here, incinerator ash. If they're using the incinerator to burn plastic, then they should have the ash analyzed so they know whether it has to be sent ashore or whether it can be dumped overboard. For exactly that reason, the presence of all the polyvinyl, whatever, this, that, and the other thing. Yeah. Another issue that can easily trip a ship up is how they document their garbage. Are they, some of the forms they're looking at, here they've got a Gaylord box, a pallet, 44-gallon containers. So what, sometimes they'll take a pallet of batteries, of starter batteries. Well, is that, what dimensions? The problem they run into is, again, the shoreside vendor that's receiving the trash documents it one way, the ship documents it the other, and the two don't always match, and it creates a lot of headaches. So, here, it's a drum, it's a 40-yard container, a pallet, a small container of glass for recycling. What's a small container? So, it's supposed to be by cubic meters according to MARPOL. But if I've got five starter batteries, how many cubic meters is that? They're on a pallet. Do I include the pallet in the cubic meter, or is it just the batteries? Yeah. Right there. Matters to be addressed. Here, waste descriptions and handling guidelines, Appendix 1 of the garbage management plan. So, and then, so we talked about the incinerator ash. Okay, Annex 6, there's basically 3 critical areas right now. First is ozone depleting substances, HCFCs. As of January 1st, ODS is verboten, basically. If the system's in service, it can remain in service, but the manufacturer of ODS, i.e. R22, is no longer allowed. And so as soon as they have a leak on the system, what are they going to do? So as a surveyor, and as you can see here on this, air pollution certificate. This ship had one AC compressor that was R22. So the question is, what's your plan to your client, to the ship owner? What are you doing? You gotta have a plan. Now there are drop-in refrigerants that can go into an R22 system without having to clean everything and change it over because the oils are compatible and everything else. But what's your plan? So how are they managing it? They're required to do a monthly inventory of all refrigerants on board. You know, that's another one that trips the chief engineer up on the cargo ships. But how many cylinders of each refrigerant has to be logged? And again, part of the dilemma is that Flag has two options. They can issue a Flag logbook that says, here, you must use this. Some do. Others, like the Bahamas, say, well, if you want to use a spreadsheet and fill that out monthly, or you want to enter it into your AMOS preventative maintenance database and track it in there, that's fine too. So it can very easily become a little bit difficult to find the documentation. NOx technical manuals. How many people have seen, for nitrogen oxides, have seen what the technical manuals are? We all know that after, 2000, you had to have Tier 1, then Tier 2, Tier 3 engines on new construction. And those vessels with Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 engines have to have a NOx technical manual. And I'll rush through this so I can get to a couple other things real quick. That has to be one for each engine, and inside that manual has the approved parts list for every component that affects the NOx emissions of that engine. So, all right, so I'm getting the high sign scrubbers. You'll be able to read through this. How for air pollution for sulfur dioxide, or sulfur oxide, excuse me. So the inspection, what we want to do is just a general walkthrough, looking for leaks, because leaks are going to give you an indication on whether or not you can trust what you're seeing in the oil record book. Okay. nice stalactite, huh? Yeah, we just, large number of pipe leaks, large number of oil leaks in the purifier rooms. Improper connections. This particular one was a ship that was arrested for the charter went bankrupt, and so it wasn't anything pollution related. But I was doing a pre-purchase survey on it, and I found them. The ship it was an expedition cruise ship, had a very small gray water tank, and they had been tied up at the dock for 60 days already. So they were using this to pump. They ran a fire hose into the gray water tank, and then were using the pumps to pump it into the ballast tanks. Now, ballast tanks can carry gray water. There's provisions for that because gray water is unregulated, but coatings, and it just creates a litany of issues. Bill.
It's called the
Magic pipes. We'll get.
You don't want to keep on board anytime magically just.
Yeah, we'll get into that real quick here. I've got a couple better pictures. So lube oil purifiers for leakages. This was a case where I had a fuel oil purifier that had a little air diaphragm chupa chupa pump built in that was transferring the sludge from a small less than 1 cubic meter tank. Here's exactly what you're talking about, Bill. Gray water. This was a gray water system that I found. Right behind me where I was standing taking this picture was a watertight door. and the transfer pipe that went under there back to the aft part of the system. And there was a corresponding fitting right there that had this exactly the same. And they would do that so they could cross connect, because there was no cross connection between the forward gray water and back. And again, that's what actually got Carnival in trouble. They had a gray water collecting tank that had a faulty overflow automatic float switch for pumping it down, would overflow into the bilges, and the crew got in the habit of taking the portable pumps, the Chupa Chupa pumps, and putting it back into the gray water system because it was gray water, forgetting it had touched the bilges. And then that became common practice for everything in the compartment, and then everything in the engine spaces. And it went on for 8 years. So let me see a couple quick other pictures, because I want to get to some critical ones. This was an interesting one. This was on a Ropax ferry that did just overnight, port to port. This was a container chassis and a 40-foot container that they used to collect their garbage, because it was not built for, the ferry was not built for for the distance that they were traveling. So they would collect their garbage, their dry waste, flammables, you name it. And it was in a container chassis on the car deck, and every week they would collect it, and then they would just have another lorry pull up and drive on, and they would just go, whoop, here you go. And that's how they did their garbage. Grease collecting tanks for food, for the cooking oil. Let me get in. So I want to get on the, those are some scrubber pictures, process tanks, ballast systems. So how many of you have seen that when you're testing an oily water separator? The little brush. What's that for? That's your photo cell for your oily water separator, for your oil content meter. And the crew will say, oh, you go down, you say, I want to see your 15 ppm alarm. All right, they take the cap off, they shove the brush down in it, blocks the entire photo cell. Readings go to double E, which means that it is maxed out the system. Three-way valve closes, and away they go, and they say, oh, it works. Or they stick their finger down there, or they take a cup of coffee and pour the cup of coffee down there. All of these crazy things, they are not the proper way to test an oil content meter. There's a couple of companies, Total Marine Solutions is one, but there's a few others that do annual certifications or 5-year certifications of the oil content meter, and they have a bottle of liquid that is 15 ppm that you can use to inject into this and test it. So get the ships to do that. They just need, we've gotten lazy, and for years when I started in the Coast Guard, and I was one of them, I was lazy too, and I'd accept it. Oh, the alarm worked, great. Until you start realizing you have to put your name on the international certificate that says everything works. And the reason I bring that up is we actually had a surveyor in Miami for Panama that was arrested and thrown in jail for 18 months for fraudulent certificates and fraudulent surveys. So the ethics stuff this morning can have real consequences down the road. He issued a certificate without testing the oily water separator, and was actually not on board the ship when the certificate was issued. So, all right, thank you.